Jim Mario, once again on my monthly video blog. And I'm very happy here today, after about an 8-month or so gap, I think, to once again have invited Elise to join with me in part 2. In fact, I have a pretty strong sense that there's going to be a part 3 and a part 4 too, of a rather, hopefully you'll find, interesting topic. This is actually about our dive into intimacy, sexuality through all the different genders from the perspective of the TOTAMS / Shamanic Astrology Paradigm. I desire to just, in part 1, we spent a lot of time looking into a deeper foundation about where it is we're coming from in this paradigm regarding this quite these days controversial subject regarding sex and gender and assorted topics like that. And so I'm going to just very briefly run through a little bit of the foundational material about where we're coming from, and then we can go into the sort of the expansion of that regarding what our topic here today is. So in the Shamanic Astrology Paradigm, TOTAMS paradigm astrology, what Venus will represent on a woman's chart is the version of the feminine, or we could say the gender expression of biological feminine that we would see that she's working on becoming. And then for men, the Mars position would represent the same thing. While a woman's Mars position initially begins as a projection, meaning the imagery or the archetype of the gender of that biological sex that she is looking for or keeps coming around, or that she's going to be responding to for good or ill. And then the exact same thing would happen then for men, well, men regarding their Venus position. Now, to even go back to the initial starting point in our school, the starting point is we're all human. So that's the basic thing. We start from being human, and what I'm referring to is really what we call Homo sapiens sapien, or human 1.0, meaning not humans that are hybrid with AI. I mean, real organic human beings. All right. Then there is the issue of what sex you're born as, and so therefore we use the word sex not to be confused with gender. And in fact, in some ways, the word gender has been hijacked in a lot of ways. So now people think of them as interchangeable. The way we're looking at it is that you're born as an XX human or an XY human, and 1 in 5,000 births, it's pretty rare, which is called intersex, could have, like a proportion of almost like a merging of XX and XY, where a baby could be born with genitals and with a vulva and so on. But that's really rare. So basically, we start out as sex XX or XY, and those are two kinds of humans. Now, in the if I just briefly would say something here about my own background on this. In the early 70s, there was the original, at least in the Western culture, revolution against the gender stereotypes for men and women. And it was at that particular time that a lot of us at that point that got into mythic astrology and were very much influenced by the feminine principle, and noticing that regular basic astrology didn't have much to do with the feminine. It was rather a patriarchal system. We were integrating into astrology a lot about the goddess, a lot about the feminine principle. And that was, I think, a very legitimate reaction against stereotypical, culturally identified, quote, gender roles. what has happened recently, we have this whole thing, LGBTQIA plus, and then in some versions of it, it goes up to 72 different kinds, right? And that is maybe one way you could do this, but not if you confuse that with sex. So for example, it's always been understood among indigenous people and in hunter-gatherer cultures that there are going to be a certain proportion of people who are not comfortable with what the cultural roles would be. And I completely support that. But we have in this system a way of looking at gender. And what is gender? Gender and by the way, this is believe it or not, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm using a WHO definition. The WHO refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys, this is straight from their website, that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, man, girl, or boy, as well as the relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. I completely agree with that, but that is not the same as sex. And through the 70s, even some of the feminist writers would go back and forth between, sometimes they would be saying gender and sometimes they mean sex, and they would say sex and when they mean gender. So there's been a great deal of confusion about that. And before 1970, the word gender was primarily used for grammar. So you then have like Romance languages that, will say that this particular noun is masculine and this is feminine. And actually, in my second book, The Origins of the Paradigm, I have a long section about how in the history of global humanity, there's different cultures have made different choices, like German and many 20, 30 different languages would see the sun, for example, as feminine and the moon as masculine. And then further back, it's like they don't even make a distinction. There's gods and goddesses for both. So I'm not attempting to say it should be the opposite of what we normally think, but rather that we need to expand our view on this kind of thing. And I think our system of the 24 expressions of Venus and Mars do a pretty good job of this. So let me indicate here that as a resource here, and it's something that at least you and I introduced in part one, we showed the 24 cards from the divination deck that try to give a visual artistic rendition of the 24 versions of masculine and feminine, the 24 genders for men and women, and that is a reference here. And as we go through our discussion in greater depth here now, we can briefly bring those up. But Carway, why don't you just show what I'm speaking about for a moment, so you can see what they have, what we have as a resource as part of this video blog. And this is our title, The Full Spectrum of the Archetypal Masculine and the Archetypal Feminine in Intimacy, Sexuality, and Relationships. And then this is, I think, a marvelous resource. The categories of the Archetypal Feminine from 3 different perspectives, and the Archetypal Masculine. And actually, the feminine one is kind of an updated one that Carway found. So these are the current renditions of this, showing how the signs line up with a 4-fold categorization of for men and women. And that you can use that as a reference for further inquiry and wondering about this and thinking about this after listening to what we have to say here. Then just briefly, you can this one here we'll come back to but let me just show you the other, show us the other ones. Yeah, so we've taken each sign or each mystery school and shown the male and female versions, which would then represent the 24 gender expressions of biological male or female. And then also as a reference to something that Elise and I got into in part 1, which are the relationship axes. And that has much more to do with if you're going to be in a long-term committed relationship, what's the main reason for it, and how can you tell if you're on the right track, which is a slightly different discussion than what we're going to get into here today. And now for once you've gone through, thank you for that, Carway. And why don't we go back to that one slide about Yin and Yang. The one that is that spectrum of maximum Yang and that, yes. So the way this is set up, and this can change from different time periods in history, but this is kind of how I would see it works now. And it's relative to the quote West, meaning US, EU, Crown colonies, and all those who have been overshadowed by it. In other words, the so-called advanced countries. So we have on one end maximum Yang. Yang is usually the word that is associated with archetypal masculine. And then on the other end is maximum Yin. Yin, again, being a word that is frequently used to illustrate what would be feminine. Now, above the different gender expressions, there are going to be some biologically female humans that will have an archetype that is way over to the Yang. And there will be some biologically born males that is way over to the Yin. So you cannot just do that thing that is kind of popularly done. All men are a certain way, all women are a certain way, you know, which is just at this stage of our culture is, in my opinion, pure foolishness. You know, I mean, it's so superficial to look at it that way. So
and this continuum here, I feel like is so important for the men that don't feel like they fit in with the cultural, you know, view of what a man is supposed to be. And then also for women, the fiery women, and maybe what they get, the feedback they get from the culture.
Right.
It's just so, it's amazing to see it this way, because it gives everybody permission or an understanding or compassion for where they are on the spectrum. And it's all equal and it's all important.
Extremely important point, because to have a really healthy culture, and that would include globally, to have a place on the wheel for all of these without judgment, and because whatever culture you're in does, in fact, impose categories that people can suffocate in, you know, or they don't feel that they can actually be how they really are because of what they're expected to be. I'll just give one example about how other cultures have seen it, and there's so many examples of this, that in the work of Robert Lawler, who investigated a long part of his life was investigating the Aboriginal culture of Australia and Tasmania, as well as southern India. And he said that among those people, it was completely understood that 1/12 of biological men and women would choose same sex. I mean, that was absolutely considered normal for that. And so it's about 1/12. So then they assumed that, and then they were considered to be special, you know. They then became the, you know, the priests or the heyokas or the, you know, that is a much healthier way of looking at it than say what happened in the Middle Ages where you'd have eunuchs. You know, where, which is an earlier version of sexual, or what could we say, of mutilation, you know. And then in places in Asia like Thailand or even here where I live, many men are not comfortable with more of a macho male role, so they become lady boys, you know. So they actually dress as beautiful women, you know, and that's been going on a long time. Anybody who was in the early 70s who were, you know, aware of the David Bowies and, you know, the glams and the, you know, the basically the cross-dressing and trying to be, you know, ambiguous about your sexuality, but I'm not aware of any of them cutting off parts of themselves, you know. It was just a way of demonstrating that they're more than the cultural role or different than the cultural role. It can be very freeing, actually, and there will always be happening at Halloween parties and as it was done in theater before, you know. Peter Pan was generally a girl, you know.
And that dressing that way, say in the culture you live in, is completely acceptable. It's understood.
It is actually even a Catholic country, yeah.
Okay.
There's different variations on it, like in place they accept it in Bali, but it's also accepted in Bali that after you have your 4 or 5 years of being gay, then you get married and have kids. So it's a different variation of the tradition. Anyway, that's just an aside, trying to establish some foundation here. Now, our project today is specifically around, let's say if you have a group of men, it might be useful if you want to have a healthy, fulfilling relationship with a woman, or actually the same thing happens for men who have same-sex proclivity, you know, the projection onto a partner. It's really important to know what the intimacy and sexual style is of that person you're with or you want to be with. And if we have a whole group of women, you know, then, you know, like here are the different types of men. It might be useful to know what they're actually like, you know, without making it too, what would be the word? Secularized. It would be like, men, what would be the foreplay techniques that will work on that person you're interested in? Or, you know, the same thing for women, because some women are more actional. They're not like interested in being in that role where they expect the guy to be dominant or to be the one who takes the action. You know, so to be able to be aware of those things, I think, is incredibly important, and that's what we're going to explore together. Because you and I have had many years of discussing this, you know, I mean, relative to our own experiences.
Yes. Yes. I think it's very important because obviously sex is one of those things that none of us are taught at any time, and we're supposed to figure it out on our own. So what a great paradigm for giving some indication of what that style might be for a person.
And if I could also just mention here that the leading edge word would be intimacy, of which sexuality would simply be one of the ways to be intimate. You know, so this would also be like having the depth of intimacy psychologically, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally. You know, so there's other than just simply sex itself, right?
Right. It could be argued that all of that is sex in
Pardon
the
me?
larger. It could be argued that all of that is sexuality, you know, the whole kit and caboodle.
Sexuality and intimacy. Yep.
Yeah.
So, so we're going to illustrate this by some of these different gender archetypal expressions. Where would you like to start?
Well, I was thinking we could start with Taurus. And obviously, the senses would be very important for Taurus. I've heard you say before that when a Taurus walks into a room, they can feel if that's right for them or not. And so it's also the biggest receiver of all the signs. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about is Taurus not actional and waiting to receive? And then also we know that Taurus, when it finds something it likes, it sticks with it. So would there be kind of a routine aspect to intimacy and sexuality
Well,
as
often
well?
it ends up being connected to the word loyalty. So, like, for example, authentic Taurus is not promiscuous. In other words, a part of it is about knowing what's good, and it's recognizing what is, whether it's who gives me a massage, who takes me out to dinner. It's like there's a certain aesthetics to it where one has the opportunity to enjoy the experience. It's not like getting to a goal. So the savoring and an enjoyment of the intimacy is most important. And as you've rightly said here, with the possible exception of a certain expression of Leo, Taurus is really the only one that's exclusively about receiving. So what is right receivership? Well, part of it is knowing what's good, but it's also about recognizing that intimacy, sexuality and intimacy, is an end in itself. It doesn't have some other goal. So we call it intimacy as art. Intimacy is art, where the goal is not we're going to have a baby from this, or we're going to have a marriage from it, or we're going to be fulfilling some kind of social expectation from it, but rather the enjoyment of the intimacy for its own sake if certain standards are met. So
That's the important part.
although there can be shadow expressions of it, of course, and where the superficial aspect of Taurus, I mean, it's one of the ones that has been very much violated by patriarchy. So a lot of people think of Taurus as being like the the glossy centerfold or something, the external version of what the culture might believe to be beauty. When in fact the essence of Taurus is that individual who carries authentic Taurus, it's their purvey, it's their essence to know what intimacy is and to know what beauty and aesthetics are, rather than to try to conform to what a culture says that it is, or what maybe patriarchy advertising agency says it's supposed to be. So it's a good Taurus is the one who is taking command of it, right? But why? Not to change the world, but for their own experience. So it's designed for the fulfillment of their own desire.
And it's slow, as opposed to some other signs that might be fast or want to move through it.
It's more about being than doing.
Yeah, right.
And it's actually like when people think of the sun sign Taurus, and that's not what we're speaking of right now. Often the regular culture, secular, mainstream understanding of sun signs is often their shadow. So, for example, why would Taurus as a sun sign be considered to be stubborn or resistant to change, or slothful, or eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die, all those kinds of things? It's because it comes from the original essence, which is if you find something that's good, there's no need to change it. Just go deeper into it. It's like the ancient mystery school in Greece of Epicureanism, where you receive, it's artistic, you know it's good, but you also are in moderation. So it's not extremes, which is exactly the opposite of, say, Scorpio, which, the example that I think you've heard me say before is like Taurus is like, well, what's good? Well, two glasses, and it's just one example. I'm not advocating this per se. It's just that 2 glasses of high-end wine, that's wonderful, but a third glass is a headache. Well, so we don't do that, but we don't deny ourselves what feels good. So it's not stoic. Scorpio, on the other hand, in their investigation of their essence, they might say, well, 2 is good. I sure need to find out about 3, and let's do 4 or 5, So it's part of the project to go beyond the edge, and it's nothing about moderation. Although there's a way of getting to wisdom that way, it's the way that William Blake once said, and specifically, I think, related to Scorpio here, you can't know how much is enough until you know how much is too much.
Right.
But that's a tricky thing, so just as Taurus can get stuck in something that's not really pleasurable, just out of habit, Scorpio could actually get over-identified with going to the edge and getting in some big trouble, rather than taking the lesson from knowing how much is enough,
Maybe we could talk about the differences then between Venus in Mars and Venus in Taurus and Mars in Taurus.
Yeah, so back to the way we would perceive this in this paradigm. A woman's Venus position is what she is trying to develop familiarity and expertise with. A man's Mars is, for him, what he's working on and trying to develop expertise in. And so there's different ways that the culture will allow that. I mean, I guess in more recent times, until recent, actually, maybe if we go back 50 years, there tended to be more support for men being that way. So, boys, if they had the Scorpio archetype and it was allowed by their family, they were indulged if they did go to the edge. It's like, it's fine to be a bad boy, or that kind of thing. Well, a girl that would be very much more villainized, this bad girls were not allowed, as it were. They were demonized. But in more recent times, there's been a much more liberation of the Scorpio archetype for women, because it actually goes back to matrilineal times, where the feminine principle was the active force. So it has to do with commanding the energy, Shakti, commanding life force. It is for self-interest, of course. I mean, it's because it's part of the responsibility of Scorpio to find out where the turn on is, and so it's kind of like with Scorpio, if you don't feel anything, there's probably nothing for you there.
So on Taurus, maybe you could say a little bit more about Venus in Taurus versus Mars in Taurus and what that would look like, intimacy wise.
Well, in more recent times, I mean, let's say with the under the command of patriarchy, the option for Venus and Taurus, and this is more of a shadow expression, would be to be a surface level receiver, like the woman who is supported by the guy, but then he's basically just giving her stuff, and well, it's never enough, So I know many male clients, let's say, who made the mistake of being with they're giver men, let's say, they're men that really want to support the woman, they really want to provide nourishment to the woman, but then what their experience is, if it's that patriarchal Taurus, basically that woman is just, that has nothing to give back. You know, she just, I need more stuff. I need more stuff. I thank you for giving me the brand new car. Thanks for taking me to the best restaurants. You know, thanks for taking me on these expensive vacations. But then the guy ends up being drained from the experience. But in obviously that's the more shadow expression of it. But I can have a lot of compassion for it because patriarchy has demonized Taurus, you know, in much of the way that we perceive the elevation of the only external form, you know, like I use the example of like a Playboy pinup or something, you know, or corresponding to advertising imagery, you know, generally run by men about what women are supposed to look like. You know, so that's been the damage there. You know, actually, as kind of as a side note, men, there are women that I've worked with Venus in Taurus or Moon in Taurus, you know, with a strong Taurian element. And whenever we talk about this deeper essence of Taurus, intimacy is art, beauty and aesthetics, they rebel against that, and particularly if it's women who are more intellectually or, you know, sophisticated. You know, it's like this because they can't get beyond the idea that the hijack of Taurus, you know, into some superficial, glossy kind of thing, rather than that deeper essence. You know, so I think women with Venus in Taurus or that strong Taurus, it's not that easy, shall we say, for the self-love to be there at the deeper essence of Taurus, and to actually then choose wisely of as far as who you're going to be with. You know, they're not just seeing you for the external. You know, they're not just projecting patriarchal Aphrodite onto you, and not interested in knowing that deeper essence.
Right. And the clients I've worked with, mostly women, whenever I get to Taurus in their chart, you know, a significant planetary body, like you said, like the moon or Venus in Taurus or something else, there is an aversion to receiving that much. There's an aversion to pleasure. There's an aversion to that. And there's some of them where it's like crucial that they step into that or recover that. And they just backpedal away from it. It's pretty striking.
This might have been my experience too. Yeah, it's true. That's certainly one of the archetypes of the feminine that it's not the only one, obviously, but most needs to be reclaimed. You know.
Yeah. Yes.
And actually, if men with Mars in Taurus, and this is more to do with the way the culture believes men are supposed to be, you know. So a lot of these yin expressions, of which Taurus is one of them, is sometimes very difficult for a man to accept. You know, it's okay for me to receive. It's okay for me to emphasize beauty and aesthetics. I've seen actually a lot of Taurian men in my practice who they're the ones, particularly if they have a little bit of a Leo aspect in them, they're the ones that become the celebrity chefs. Or, or that rather than the deeper sense of intimacy that is possible with that one, you know, if they're able to receive and to value their intimacy, what do you suppose they do? They become bodybuilders. You know, so it's the body beautiful, you know, which it's understandable, you know. I mean, that's but still it can be tacking on that thing which can cover over a deeper value of receiving an intimacy, you know.
Well, and also we could just say overall, the U.S. culture, I can't really speak for other cultures, but the U.S. culture often thinks of sex as like the performance model or a goal to achieve or a job to get done, right? And so Taurus is so different from that. It's being in a field together and stretching it out as long as possible. You know, people have an aversion to that too, because it's like it's a little too maybe self-indulgent or something.
Right.
So I think that,
And-
that people miss that deeper element like just so easily.
yes. And actually also another good example of the genuine, authentic Taurian masculine approach is based on the fact that it's an earth sign. So like working with their hands, working in a kinesthetic way, working with the soil, with the earth. Often they will end up being really good handymen, or mechanics, stuff like that. So they don't mind building beautiful things, or at least functional things. So
Right.
yeah, that's a good way that they can operate. But to really be able to receive and to value intimacy per se, that they don't have to, quote, do anything to earn it. Wow.
Mhm.
I mean, this
Right.
harkens back to the original pre-patriarchal story of Taurus, which in pre-Celtic land was called the Dagda, and it was called the Irish bull god. Taurus, the bull god, right? And in that time period, the understanding was that a man that could not gain his sovereignty unless he first married the land. And so those were the ceremonies. So the man would marry the land first, even before he would have a marriage.
That's beautiful. That's so beautiful. So do we think we could move on, or is there anything
Sure,
left?
sure,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay. So the next one I was thinking about is Gemini, and it's so mentally oriented that I can imagine the intimacy, the romance may involve like a lot of mental aliveness or humor or play, but not so much deep emotional sharing, like more of a light romance. And then there's this element of Gemini being the most sexually fluid of all the archetypes. So how might that show up intimacy wise and sexually speaking?
Well, there is the other aspect of Hermes or Cocopele, all things that are identified with Gemini archetype for both men and women here. But I'm speaking of, let's say, the masculine version now, which is the shapeshifter. So we basically have this well-known story that comes from France, Spain, places like that, of Don Juan. Now Don Juan loves women. So he's not an exploiter of women. But what his special talent is to become aware of what the woman most longs for, and then shapeshifts into that, and then he's on his way. So basically it's a wonderful magical connection, as long as the woman does not project boyfriend, husband, father, like that kind of thing. So this is kind of a puer, and for females, puella kind of archetype. But you're right in saying that it's also considered to be quite sexual. Yes, because actually even back in Greece, there would actually be what are called herms, which were stacks of stones, and they would be placed outside of where a woman is, right, saying Hermes has been here. That he has made a visit, and depending on what the archetype of the woman is, it could be a very delightful connection, So while I don't want to, certainly this can be a shadow side of Gemini, which could be judged as being just promiscuous, we could say sexuality without intimacy, but they're actually shape shifting into a form of intimacy, but then they just are on their way because it's a free electron. They don't bond. It's not a bonding archetype, right? So it's one of the ones that is really insistent on remaining free, but very social and very much It's certainly not a renunciate one. Okay, it's
Yeah.
not. It's not a monk archetype. And even in the Native American version, Kokopelli, which actually in some parts of the Southwest, the natives have seen Kokopelli on the moon. It's not a rabbit. It's the flute player, right? And so their stories are, well, yeah, the full moon will get you pregnant. And what they're basically saying is that Kokopelli has visited you. So so there's these sort of potency things associated with it, right? But if the woman does not want to, if she's projecting boyfriend, father, or husband, well, what's the modern version of it? It would be like the traveling musician, the traveling salesman, and probably the heyday of that whole thing was the late 60s, early 70s, where the lifestyle of the artists and the musicians was very much like that.
Yeah.
And plenty of women loved that possibility.
So would you say there's any difference really, or what is the difference maybe between Venus and Gemini and Mars and Gemini, or are they?
Well, it's been my experience that actually if we look at that spectrum of maximum yang and maximum yin, like Gemini is kind of right in the middle, and so that's another way of saying that probably the polarity between maximum yin and maximum yang is least present there. So basically the female version of it, unless it's an extremely advanced psychological version of it, which then is the psychopomp. A person, let's say Gemini, can be a giver, a therapist, that kind of thing, and they're assisting people on their journeys into the underworld and out of the underworld, into the celestial and back down from the celestial. But they, aside from that one, there's very little difference. The Gemini feminine and the Gemini masculine are real similar. It's not as differentiated as some of the other ones.
Right. Anything else on that you wanted to share that you found?
Well, I mean, just say for a woman who has Venus and Gemini, right, or Gemini rising, but let's just keep it focused on the Venus and Mars positions. Her role in a relationship is certainly not going to be somebody's mother or somebody's caregiver or so basically she wants to be valued. And this is, I think, an important thing to bring up in looking at all of these, is that there's a very simple little phrase you can put with a woman's Venus or a man's Mars, and that is, how would she desire to be valued? How would he desire to be valued? So if a woman has Venus in Cancer, my goodness, does she ever want to be valued differently than Venus in Gemini or Venus in Aquarius? Or I mean, if we talked about Aries, if a woman has Venus in Aries, she would be valued for her commitment, but she would also be valued for being having a mission and purpose statement, like having a career, having the ability to be actional, to be more yang in the relationships, So, I mean, even in same-sex relationships, I mean, you can easily see, who would be the quote dominant one, or the more yang one. And you can always see it with Venus in Aries or Venus in Leo, one of these ones that are more yang. And so they're actually acting more like what would be the classic patriarchal male role, in the situation.
Yeah, and Venus and Gemini, I can imagine, would want to be valued for being the one who brings the fun, the lightness, the play.
And tremendous curiosity. You'd be able to talk about anything, and to be a good talker, I mean, yeah. if you're with a woman with Venus and Gemini, you're going to have to be a man with Mars and Gemini. Often it will show up with the moon also, which is to be willing to have lots of conversations,
Yes, right. Well, good. I think we covered Gemini then.
Yeah,
So the next,
why don't we, let's see, what would be the one you most want to talk about? And it's very clear that we're going to have to be able to do a part 3 and part 4. And I
I
mean,
see.
hopefully those that are listening, feel free to request which ones we would talk about next,
Right,
because
right.
otherwise it becomes a 2-hour video blog, which is what we do not want to do. But yes, so
No,
where do we want to
I
go
would
next?
say I would say Virgo, just because I think it's so
Yes.
misunderstood. Um, and I just, there's a focus on the sacred, of course, for Virgo. So there's just great discernment on so many different levels when it comes to sex and intimacy. And, it's an impersonal sign. So maybe not so interested in relationship per se. So I just wanted you to speak about that a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. And actually, here's one where, at least in our more recent culture, that there's a difference between the masculine Virgo and the feminine Virgo. If we use that expression for, say, Venus and Virgo for a woman, how would she desire to be valued? Well, the word I love the most is discrimination, but multifaceted. So in the discrimination, what Venus and Virgo would most want is to be able to trust being intimate on all levels. So like spiritual intimacy, psychological intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy. And then when the timing is right, because it's
Right.
all about sacredness, then it could be sexual intimacy, right? But it's like all that can't be overridden. There have been attempts, and I've certainly known this in my own life, and I've seen it with many clients, that the woman with this extremely precise, actually, and pattern capacity and discrimination, not critical, but discriminating. If she might think there's something wrong with her. And so there have been attempts, but a woman might, well, I need to override the discrimination. So if I drink a lot, or if I do drugs, or, then but as far as I'm concerned, it just makes it worse, because it's really a devaluing of what her true essence is. Now, unless those standards are met, why would there actually be intimacy if it's not sacred? It's not secular. So creating of a safe space for her to feel safe, to have all those levels addressed. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be perfect. As a matter of fact, I'm often thinking back to something that Freud is famous for saying: what does woman want? Of course, Freud, 90% of his clientele were men. One of the differences between Jung, who great majority of his clients were women, so that's how different views on the whole thing. But anyway, the truth is, the complexity of a woman can never be fully known, but only some men are fascinated and interested in it. So you have certain types of men who say, well, I'll never figure it out, so I don't care, I just do what I do. But a more evolved version of Mars and Virgo, I'm speaking of men now, Mars and Virgo, could actually become quite fascinated with that complexity in the feminine. But from our cultural perspective, in more recent times, usually Mars and Virgo men are going to be obsessed with their work. Their sacred work, and that's really the thing can happen for women with a strong Virgo too. Their sacred work is incredibly important. But depending on the rest of the chart, how can I best say this? Going back further in history, Virgo would be a renunciate one. It would be the priestesses in the temple. It would be in Catholic, you know, it would be if you can't make it as a mother or wife, well, there's always the convent, you know. So that was the compensatory thing for Virgo. But today, that's no longer the case, you know. So Venus and Virgo could want very much to have personal intimacy, and I was just describing it's a very specific way for it to happen. The same thing would be true for men with Mars and Virgo if you ever got them interested in personal intimacy rather than their work, you know. So
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Just want to reiterate how important it is for a woman with Venus and Virgo, or some important placement of Virgo, but Venus and Virgo in particular, to understand that about herself. I think it could be a revelation because the culture is encouraging women to go ahead and have sex, and sort of letting young women know there's all these different kind of orgasms. You can go for it, just do it. And then there's a self-violation that can occur with a Venus and Virgo. So I think it's just so important for women to understand this kind of deep archetype that they carry, and would help them, I think, have a lot of self-compassion.
Right, as well as the importance of training men about this.
Right, exactly. Yeah. How important that is for her. If you're going to be with me, you've got to understand, you know, all the levels I need to be met at.
The Virgo one is quite important because as I said, until fairly recently, it was one that wasn't even trained to do personal intimacy.
Right.
You know, so therefore it would be judged as being cold or critical or almost inhuman. The judgments against Venus and Virgo in mainstream astrology are just off the scales. And being a man with Venus and Virgo, I made it part of my mission as a contrarian astrologer to point out how violating this was of Virgo, because a non-understanding of its authenticity, and it's just as valid as any of the other expressions. There's no better or worse one. We just have to get to know all of their uniquenesses, right?
Right. The essence of them.
So we'll probably have to wrap this one up soon. Yeah. And I love how this is transpiring because it opens the door for, I mean, there's so many others to look at, including the giver ones, you know, Cancer, Pisces, the ones that are just often not relational at all. You know, the Amazon ones, the warrior ones, and so on. Those intimacy and sexuality styles certainly are worthy of going more deeply into, and love doing that as we go forward. Maybe not next month, but maybe the month after. You know, we could do that, and I would love to get feedback on this from. What do you all want us to talk about? You know, I mean, because this obviously this doesn't work so well with quick little sound bites. Although we did the best with the sound bites, if you reference the 24 cards, you know, of the 24 genders of the masculine and feminine. Now, before we complete this, I did want to make just two announcements. This is late, kind of like breaking news in our school. We're now currently, if you're not getting the newsletter, and I would think a lot of you that are on the call do, but in case you're not, we're doing a newsletter sign-up promotion running until the release of course 2 of our certification level courses, and that will come up in late July. So until that happens, anyone who subscribes receives the free access to our full course, the basic course. So that's free. We generally people can. I mean, if you're a member already, it's free. But if you're not a member, and you just simply sign up for the newsletter, you get this course free. Encourage your friends, family, clients, and colleagues to subscribe to the newsletter, and you can get the free course. The second announcement is TOTAMS now has a Telegram channel for those who like to do that. It's on a mobile or desktop Telegram app, and search for Turning of the Ages Mystery School and follow on Telegram. So that's another way to connect with the school, in addition to our community forums. So always a pleasure having these conversations with you, and I value your perspective, and I know this is part of your PhD project also.
Yes, yes. Thank you. This is so much fun for me too.
Till next time. See you
Next
all.
time. Thank you.